Pop Suds ready, webhead?
I was only kidding.
Okay, Iceman, now give him the quick deep freeze. If that line just played in your head in a voice you haven't heard in 40 years, congratulations! You just unlocked a very specific corner of your childhood. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends premiered on NBC in September 1981 and did something nobody else was doing on Saturday morning television at the time. It put Spider-Man in a shared college dorm with two other superheroes, gave them secret identities to protect, classes to attend, and a hidden headquarters behind a closet wall in their aunt's apartment. It ran for 3 seasons. It was genuinely popular. And then it ended in November 1983 with an episode so quiet, so completely lacking in any sense of finality that most fans who watched it live had no idea they were watching the last one. And decades later, Marvel did something to these characters in the comics that fans are still genuinely upset about. This is the real story of how it all went down. Here's what we're covering. How Stan Lee built this show as Marvel's answer to the Super Friends. The legal mess that turned the Human Torch into an entirely new character. The episode so loaded with Nazi imagery that streaming platforms still skip it today. The actual final episode and why nobody realized it was the final episode. And the brutal way Marvel Comics killed these characters off decades later. And why the backlash got bad enough that Marvel had to publicly walk it back. Let's get into it. Part 1. How it got made. This show exists because of one very specific cartoon that came before it. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends was NBC's attempt to replicate the success ABC had with Super Friends. Hanna-Barbera's Justice League show that had been dominating Saturday mornings for years. Marvel looked at that and said, "We have our own roster. Let's build our own team-up show." Stan Lee was personally involved at almost every level. He was part of the casting process. He was involved in the animation direction, and he served as the in-universe narrator, opening every single episode. For a Saturday morning cartoon to have its actual comic book creator functioning as the on-screen host was unusual, and it gave the show a sense of authenticity that other toy-driven cartoons of the era simply didn't have. The original plan was Spider-Man, Iceman, and the Human Torch. But legal issues over the Human Torch character, the same rights problem that had already caused trouble for the 1978 Fantastic Four cartoon, forced Marvel to create a replacement character instead. That replacement went through several names before landing on the final version. Firefly, Starblaze, Heatwave, eventually Firestar. Here's what's genuinely interesting about that decision. Firestar wasn't just a placeholder built to fill a gap in the lineup. She eventually debuted in the actual Marvel Comics in Uncanny X-Men, went on to become a founding member of the New Warriors, and later joined the Avengers. A character invented specifically to solve a licensing headache ended up with a real and lasting career in Marvel canon. That almost never happens with characters created purely for a cartoon adaptation. Voice actress Kathy Garver, who played Firestar, has talked about the unusual production process. The storyboards were completed before any voice recording happened, and the cast would do a full read-through to get a feel for the show before stepping into the booth. That's a more deliberate process than most Saturday morning productions bothered with. The show ran in 3 structured bursts. Season 1 delivered 13 standalone adventures. Season 2 pulled back to focus entirely on origin stories. The origin of Iceman, Along Came Spidey, a Firestar is born, giving each character room to breathe before diving back into team adventures. Season 3 returned to standalone stories for 8 episodes before the finale. 24 episodes total across 3 seasons. Then, reruns carried it all the way through 1986 as part of the syndicated Marvel Action Universe block. If this is unlocking memories you forgot you had, hit subscribe right now. I dig into the real history behind the cartoons that built Saturday mornings every single week. Part 2. The episode streaming services still skip. The show had a stable creative core throughout its run. Mihan and Toei Animation contributed to some of the animation work. Yes, the same Toei behind a huge amount of Japanese anime, which gave certain sequences a level of polish you didn't usually see in American Saturday morning programming. But there's one episode that's become something between a legend and a cautionary tale among fans, and it's the reason a lot of people who only watch the reruns never actually saw the complete original series. Season 1, Episode 13, The Quest of the Red Skull. The plot follows the Red Skull attempting to kidnap the Spider Friends, specifically so they can't interfere with his plan to literally restart World War II. The episode leaned heavily into actual Nazi imagery. The backlash and discomfort around this content meant it was either entirely omitted or heavily edited in later broadcast packages and home releases. Kids who only ever caught the reruns during the Marvel Action Universe years were shielded from ever seeing this episode in its original form. A lot of modern streaming releases skip it entirely. It's a strange artifact of just how different the standards were in 1981 compared to even a few years later. Content that got waved through initially and then quietly buried as sensitivities shifted. Part 3, the episode that wasn't about Spider-Man at all. Before we get to the actual ending, there's an episode worth talking about because it set up everything that followed. The X-Men Adventure, Season 3, Episode 7. This was a full crossover event. Stan Lee opens the episode talking directly about the X-Men and Marvel's mutant roster. The Spider-Friends find themselves at the X-Mansion teaming up with Storm, Sprite, Nightcrawler, Cyclops, Colossus, and Professor X to face down a villain named Siberian. Here's the twist that makes this episode genuinely interesting. Despite the title, this isn't really a Spider-Man episode at all. It's a Firestar episode. Siberian has history with Angelica Jones, Firestar's civilian identity, from before either of them had powers. A lab accident left him horribly injured, and he blames her directly for what happened to him, eventually transforming into a cybernetic villain, specifically to get revenge. The X-Men themselves, despite getting a full roster appearance, mostly stand around in the background without much dialogue. They each get a moment to show off their powers, but the emotional weight of the episode belongs entirely to Firestar's backstory. Looking back at it now, this plays as the last big ensemble spectacle before the show quietly wound down. And notably, the writers chose to make the emotional climax personal and small rather than another giant action set piece. If you're enjoying this drop a comment telling me which forgotten 80s cartoon you want covered next. I read every single one. And subscribe if you haven't. This is exactly what this channel does every week. Now, the actual ending, and why almost nobody realized it was one at the time. Part 4, the finale. Nobody knew was a finale. The last episode, Mission, Save the Guard Star, first aired on November 4th, 1983. Written by Dennis Marks, directed by Don Jurich. The plot centers on Iceman's younger half-sister, a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named Lightwave, who can manipulate and transform into pure light. She goes rogue and sabotages the Guardstar satellite. As the team investigates, they discover she's actually being controlled through mind manipulation by a rogue S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named Buzz Mason, who intends to use a quantum intensifier to amplify her abilities, seize control of the satellite, and eventually take command of global weapon systems. Many fans who've gone back to study the show point out something genuinely strange about this ending. There are no villains permanently defeated, no secret identities revealed, no sense of these 3 years actually concluding anything. Lightwave's future with S.H.I.E.L.D. is left completely open. Any possibility of future X-Men or Avengers crossovers is left hanging. The show simply stopped, dissolved into reruns, and that was that. Some of that was likely intentional structuring. Episodic shows of this era rarely planned dramatic series finales because nobody knew for certain which episode would be the last one to air. Some of it feels accidental, like the show just ran out of momentum at an arbitrary point in its production schedule, Either way, the ending that exists doesn't function as a real conclusion to anything. It's simply where the story happened to stop. Part 5. The comic that killed everyone and the backlash that followed. Here's where the story takes a turn that genuinely upset a lot of longtime fans decades later. The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3, Issue 7, introduced a reality designated Earth 1983, explicitly built to represent the world of this cartoon, described in the comic itself as kinder, gentler than most worlds in the multiverse. In the story, the villain Morlun, an ancient predator who hunts and feeds on spider totems across the entire multiverse, arrives in this reality, tracking down Peter Parker. He doesn't find Spider-Man at home initially. Instead, he encounters Iceman and Firestar first, and savagely kills both of them before Spider-Man even arrives. When Spider-Man returns to find what happened, Morlun grabs him, comments on how naive and gentle this particular reality was, which explained why Spider-Man had no framework to even process what he'd just walked into, and then kills him too, describing the experience of consuming his life force as one of the sweetest things he'd ever tasted. These were characters who had spent 3 seasons protecting each other, going to college together, hiding a literal secret headquarters from the world. And in one comic issue, they're murdered off-panel before the audience even gets a real fight scene. The backlash to these deaths was severe enough that Marvel had to step in and publicly clarify that the murdered Spider-Friends were specifically from an expendable alternate universe. Seemingly damage control after fans pointed out that the writer responsible was known for deliberately provocative public statements and had claimed the original show never had any real life or death stakes to begin with, which a lot of longtime fans felt badly mischaracterized what the show actually was. It's a genuinely uncomfortable footnote to a show that most people remember as warm, lighthearted Saturday morning television. The characters who taught a generation of kids about teamwork and secret identities got wiped out in a single comic issue, off-panel, by a villain whose entire purpose is to literally eat superheroes. There's at least some recent comfort for fans, though. In the comic Spider-Boy, it's been confirmed that all the characters killed by Morlun have since returned to life following the events of End of the Spider-Verse, with a glimpse of Earth 1983 showing every member alive again. Part 6. The Voice, Cast and What Came After. The voice cast stayed remarkably consistent across the show's run. Dan Gilvezan voiced Spider-Man, Kathy Garver voiced Firestar, and also took on other roles including Storm. Frank Welker, one of the most prolific voice actors in animation history, voiced Iceman along with Ms. Lion, and a rotating cast of supporting characters. June Foray, a legend in her own right, brought Aunt May and the crime computer to life. The supporting cast read like a who's who of voice acting at the time. Peter Cullen, yes, the future Optimus Prime, voiced the Hulk and villains, including Mysterio and Red Skull. William Marshall depicted both Juggernaut and Tony Stark. Stanley Jones covered an enormous range from Professor X and Cyclops to Dracula and Nightcrawler. After the show ended, Marvel Productions kept building on this foundation, eventually producing the X-Men and Spider-Man animated series of the 1990s. Looking at the bigger picture, Spider-Man and his amazing friends functions as the bright early prototype that proved superhero team-ups could work on television outside of giant apocalyptic stakes, that you could put characters together for smaller, more personal missions and still hold an audience. The brand never fully disappeared. Marvel kept referencing the Amazing Friends phrase across comics for decades. A 2006 anniversary comic called Opposites Attack was packed with inside jokes referencing the original show. The Ultimate Spider-Man Comics 118th issue echoed the same college roommate premise, with Johnny Storm standing in as Peter's friend. And in 2021, Disney and Marvel rebuilt the concept entirely for a new generation with Spidey and his amazing friends, a preschool series on Disney Junior. It's not a direct continuation of the original universe, but the core idea, Spider-Man operating as part of a heroic team rather than purely alone, clearly survived 40 years. Here's what stays with me about this show. It was built carefully. Stan Lee personally invested. An unusually structured 3-season arc that gave characters room to develop. Animation work outsourced to one of the best studios in the business. And it ended on an episode that nobody, including the people who made it, seemed to recognize as an ending while it was happening. No closure, no final statement, just 3 superheroes saving a satellite and going back to their dorm rooms, never to be seen together in that form again. And then, decades later, in a completely different medium, Marvel killed all 3 of them off in the most casual, almost dismissive way imaginable, treating characters that meant something to an entire generation of kids as a quick snack for a multiversal predator. The show deserved a better ending than the one it got in 1983, and honestly, these characters deserved a better death than the one they got in the comics either. But the fact that people are still talking about both, 40 plus years after the original episode aired, says something about how much this weird, earnest, college dorm superhero show actually meant to people. If this brought back a memory you hadn't touched in decades, drop a comment and tell me. Hit the like button too. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of video. Subscribe if you want more. Real history behind the cartoons and franchises that built Saturday mornings. Every week. Next video is already ready. Click it right now. See you there.